Hi everyone, and welcome to Fluent English Journey. Don't forget to subscribe so you can get daily tips that will help you improve your English step by step. Have you ever had a completely normal day that suddenly turned into a day you will never forget? Or have you noticed how small choices, almost without you realizing it, can quietly change the direction of your life? Sometimes, events seem simple at first, but later we realize they leave a deep and lasting impression. And have you ever tried to tell a real-life story in English, only to find that your words sounded a little flat or unnatural? Maybe in your mind, the story seemed fine, but when you spoke it, it didn't come out the way you wanted. That happens to many people, especially when they are learning a new language. Today, on the English Talk podcast, I am Blake, and together we are going to practice telling real-life stories in English. These stories are simple, natural, and honest. They are not like the perfect stories you see in movies. They are not full of big dramatic events or shocking twists. Instead, they are the kind of stories people share with friends, family, or coworkers when they want to explain what really happened and how they felt. I will tell short stories from real life using clear and simple English. I will speak slowly so you can notice how ideas connect from one sentence to the next, how emotions are expressed, how details are added without making the story complicated. Listen carefully and pay attention to how simple words and sentences can sound very natural and even advanced when used the right way. Let's start with a story about a small mistake that taught me an important lesson. A few months ago, I agreed to help a colleague with a project. The project was already behind schedule, and they needed extra help. I didn't want to say no because I wanted to be helpful and show that I was a good team player. At first, I thought it would only take a little extra time each day, maybe 1 or 2 hours. I believed I could manage it along with my own work. But after 1 week, I realized I was working late every night, and even with the extra hours, I was falling behind on my own tasks. I started feeling frustrated, tired, and overwhelmed. At the same time, I felt responsible because I had already said yes. I couldn't just ignore the problem or hope it would go away. So instead of staying quiet, I decided to have an honest conversation with my colleague. I explained my situation clearly and calmly. I told them what I could handle and what I was struggling with. To my surprise, they understood immediately. They thanked me for being honest and open. Together, we adjusted the plan, shared the work more evenly, and successfully finished the project. This experience taught me an important lesson. Saying yes without thinking can create problems. Being honest and talking about challenges can solve them. It is okay to ask for help and share responsibilities. Even small, everyday experiences like this can teach you valuable lessons that stay with you for a long time. By listening to real stories like this, you can improve your English naturally. You can learn how people connect ideas, express feelings, and share experiences in a way that sounds real and easy to understand. Simple stories, when told well, can sound impressive and natural. This story may seem small, but it shows how people explain problems, feelings, and solutions in everyday English. Not every story has to be dramatic to be meaningful. Sometimes, small and ordinary moments teach us the most. Here's another example: an unexpected conversation with a stranger. One evening, I was standing in a long line at a small store. Everyone looked tired and a little impatient. People were checking their phones, sighing, and waiting quietly. The person in front of me suddenly turned around and made a small comment about how slowly the line was moving. I replied politely with a short, simple sentence. At first, that was all. But slowly, that tiny interaction turned into a real conversation. We started talking about work, daily stress, and small personal goals. It was simple, ordinary, and honest. When the line finally moved, we laughed together and said goodbye. Nothing dramatic happened, but that short exchange changed the mood of the moment. It made the weight feel lighter and reminded me how small conversations can connect people. Stories like this often focus on atmosphere, feelings, and small details, not big events. Real-life stories include ordinary moments, small thoughts, and reflections. They are not always perfect or exciting, but they are real. Here's one more example, making a small but important change. Last year, I wanted to change my daily routine, but I was comfortable where I was. My days were predictable, and that comfort slowly turned into boredom. One afternoon, I noticed how tired I felt even though it was still early in the day. That moment made me stop and think. I asked myself a simple question: what am I avoiding? I realized that fear of discomfort was holding me back. I didn't change everything at once. I made one small change and kept doing it every day. Over time, that small choice improved my confidence and energy. It reminded me that even little steps can make a big difference. When people share stories like this, they often move between what happened in the past and what they understand in the present. This helps listeners connect with the story and learn from it. As you listen to these stories, notice how time words help organize the story. Words like one day, at first, after a while, in the end guide the listener naturally. Remember, advanced English is not about using hard words. It is about clarity, connection, and control. When your English is clear and connected, even simple words and stories can sound impressive, natural, and easy to understand. Instead of saying something was simply good or bad, people usually explain how it made them feel. For example, instead of saying, "I was happy," you could say, "I felt relieved after the conversation." Instead of saying, "I was angry," you could say, "I felt tense and distracted all day." These small changes make stories feel more real, personal, and relatable. Listeners can imagine the situation and connect with your experience. Learning from failure. I remember one time I prepared carefully for an important discussion. I thought I knew exactly what I would say and practiced a lot. But when the moment came, my ideas did not come out the way I planned. I noticed confusion on the other person's face, and my confidence dropped immediately. I felt frustrated and a little embarrassed. Afterward, I replayed the moment in my head many times. I thought about what went wrong and what I could have done differently. Later, I realized that the failure was not because of my ability, but because I had prepared in the wrong direction. This experience taught me an important lesson: focus on clarity, not perfection. When people share stories like this, they often include reflection. Reflection shows growth and self-awareness. It helps listeners understand what was learned from the experience. Cause and effect in stories. Notice how cause and effect are explained in stories. People often use phrases like, "because of that," "as a result," "that is when I realized." These small phrases help connect actions to results and make your English sound thoughtful and mature. Using these connections can turn a simple story into something meaningful that listeners can follow and relate to. Real stories are relatable. Real stories are powerful because they are relatable. They also give you the chance to practice English the way people actually use it in conversation. You do not need complicated words. Here's another story that many people quietly relate to but rarely talk about openly. A while ago, I noticed I was always busy but rarely satisfied at the end of the day. My schedule was full, tasks were completed, and people around me thought I was doing well. Everything seemed fine from the outside. Still, I felt a constant pressure that never went away. No matter how much I finished, it felt like it was never enough. One evening, after finishing everything on my list, I finally sat down and took a deep breath. I realized that even though I was busy, I was not paying attention to what truly mattered to me. I was just moving from one task to another, reacting to what needed to be done, and forgetting to think about what made me happy or energized. That quiet moment of reflection helped me understand that it is important to make time for yourself, even when life feels busy. Awareness comes before change. Stories like these show how ordinary experiences, emotions, and reflections can be shared in English in a way that feels honest and real. By practicing with real-life examples, you can learn to explain feelings, connect ideas, and reflect on experiences naturally. That is what makes English sound fluent and thoughtful. One evening, after finishing everything on my list, I realized I could not remember the last time I had felt truly present. I had been so busy doing tasks that I had forgotten to stop and notice the moment. That moment of realization was a little uncomfortable, but it was honest. When people tell stories like this, they often focus on the realization rather than immediate action. Awareness usually comes before change. In daily conversations, people use phrases like, "I suddenly noticed. It hit me that. That was the moment I understood." These expressions are very common in natural English. They show a shift in thinking or understanding, which helps listeners follow your story clearly. Personal growth through small changes. In my case, this realization did not come from a big event or a sudden problem. It came from a quiet moment, silence, and reflection. After that, I decided to change how I measured a good day. Instead of focusing only on completing tasks, I started paying attention to how I felt during the day. Over time, this small change improved both my work and mood. I felt more relaxed, present, and satisfied. This is how people often describe personal growth in real life, step by step, honestly, and without dramatic language. Miscommunication in daily life. Now let me share another story about miscommunication, which is one of the most common topics in everyday English. One time, I sent a short message to someone, thinking it was clear and polite. Later, I received a reply that felt distant and cold. At first, I felt confused and slightly annoyed. I read my original message again and realized it sounded too brief and direct. My intention had been efficiency, but it came across as impatience. Instead of ignoring the issue, I sent a follow-up message, explaining my tone and intention clearly. Almost immediately, the tension disappeared and the conversation felt smooth again. Stories like this often explain not only what happened, but also how tone, intention, and perception affect communication. People usually reflect and correct their actions, saying things like, "I did not mean it that way. I realized how it sounded." These phrases are extremely useful for learners because they teach you how to repair conversations politely and naturally. Key takeaways. Real English is not perfect English. It is flexible, practical, and full of small choices that make communication effective. Stories sound natural when they include thoughts and reflections, emotions and feelings, connections between events and results, small realizations and learning moments. By practicing real stories like these, you can improve your English in a way that feels honest, relatable, and natural. A friend once recommended a book to me, describing it as life-changing. Naturally, I started reading it with very high expectations. I imagined it would completely change how I thought and felt. But after finishing it, I felt underwhelmed. The book was good, but it did not match the image I had built in my mind. Later, I realized my disappointment did not come from the book itself. It came from my expectations. I had built an idea in my head that was impossible to meet. When sharing this story with others, I did not criticize the book. Instead, I explained how expectations shape reactions. In everyday English, people often soften their opinions to sound balanced and respectful. They might say, "I expected more. It was not exactly what I imagined. It did not quite meet my expectations." These small phrases help you express disappointment without sounding harsh, which is an important skill in advanced English. Story 2: Responsibility and Boundaries. There was a time when I said yes to almost every request. I believed being helpful meant being available all the time. At first, it felt good to help, but slowly this habit led to exhaustion. I started feeling tired, stressed, and anxious whenever I saw a new message or request. One weekend, I realized I was dreading simple messages because I knew they would turn into obligations. That feeling was a warning sign. I decided to set clear boundaries and communicate them politely. I told people when I was available and when I needed time for myself. To my surprise, the result was not conflict as I had feared. Instead, people respected my decisions. When people tell stories about boundaries, they often focus on emotional changes more than external reactions. In natural English, these shifts are described calmly and reflectively. People use phrases like, "I started to notice," "I made a decision." Over time, things improved. These phrases signal maturity and self-awareness. Story 3. Uncertainty. Here's another common situation: facing uncertainty. I once had to make a decision where there was no obvious correct answer. Both options had advantages and risks. I felt unsure and nervous about making the wrong choice. Instead of rushing, I took time to consider my feelings and priorities. I thought about what I wanted to achieve, how each option might affect me, and what risks I was willing to take. In the end, I chose what felt right in the moment, even though it was not perfect. Stories about uncertainty often include reflection, thought process, feelings of doubt. People explain how they weighed options and thought through situations. Using simple, clear language makes your English sound natural and relatable. Common phrases include, "I was not sure," "I thought about it carefully," "In the end, I decided." These phrases are very natural in conversation and show thoughtfulness without complicated vocabulary. Story 4. Changes in relationships. Another everyday story is noticing changes in relationships. Over time, some relationships become quieter, not because of conflict, but because life becomes busy. I realized I had not had a deep conversation with someone I cared about in a long time. Our talks had slowly become short and practical. We discussed schedules and responsibilities, but not feelings or thoughts. Instead of blaming time or distance, I reached out and suggested a real conversation. That small effort reopened a meaningful connection. When people share stories like this, they often focus on intention and effort rather than blame. Emotional distance is described gently. We drifted apart. We lost touch. Things became more surface level. These expressions are subtle but powerful. They help keep your story calm, respectful, and relatable. Story 5. Learning from failure. One time, I tried something new and failed in front of other people. In that moment, the embarrassment felt intense. I wanted the moment to end quickly. Later, when I talked about it, I noticed something interesting. People laughed, shared similar stories, and related to how I felt. Over time, the failure became less about shame and more about shared experience. This is how real stories often change with time. The emotional weight becomes lighter, and the lesson becomes clearer. Story structure and common phrases. People often introduce stories with phrases like, "At the time, it felt terrible. Looking back, I can see." These phrases are very common in natural storytelling because they show growth and perspective. They help listeners understand how the storyteller changed or learned something. Real stories often focus on thoughts, emotions, small details, reflection, and small choices rather than dramatic events. Advanced English is not about sounding impressive, but about sounding human, clear, and thoughtful. Story 1. Patience. I once worked toward a goal that took much longer than I expected. At the beginning, I felt motivated and excited. I believed progress would happen quickly. But as time passed, progress stayed slow, and I became discouraged. I questioned whether the effort was worth it. Instead of quitting, I reminded myself why I had started. I focused on small improvements rather than quick results. Slowly, progress became visible. In everyday English, when people talk about patience, they often describe frustration at first, persistence over time, reflection rather than celebration. They use phrases like, I kept going, I stayed consistent, I learned to be patient. These expressions are calm, confident, and mature. They sound real because they reflect the process, not just the outcome. Story 2. Unexpected kindness. One day, during a stressful moment, someone offered help without being asked. The action itself was small, but the timing made it powerful. When I tell this story, I focus more on how it made me feel than on what exactly happened. In everyday English, people might say, it meant more than they realized. It made a difference at that moment. These expressions show emotional impact without needing many details. Story 3. Self-doubt. There was a time when I doubted whether I was capable of handling a responsibility I had already accepted. This doubt did not come from failure, it came from comparison. I noticed how easily other people seemed to manage similar situations and began to question myself. Over time, I realized an important lesson: confidence often hides effort. What looks easy from the outside often requires unseen work and struggle. When sharing stories like this, people focus on internal experience, not just appearances. Common phrases include, I started to question myself. I compared myself to others. I had to remind myself. These phrases help listeners understand thoughts and emotions clearly. Story 4. Listening matters more than speaking. A while ago, someone close to me was clearly stressed, but they were not talking much. I could sense something was wrong even though they acted normal. In the past, I might have tried to solve the problem quickly or offer advice. This time, I chose a different approach. I asked one simple question and then stayed quiet. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. I wondered if I should say more. But after a moment, they began to speak slowly and honestly. They shared thoughts and feelings they had been holding inside. In that moment, I realized my role was not to fix the problem, but to be present and listen. People often describe moments like this with phrases such as, I held back. I let them speak. I realized listening was enough. These expressions show emotional maturity, control, and awareness. Silence can sometimes be more powerful than words. Story 5. Quiet reflection and space. There was a time when I believed that being busy meant being important. I filled every day with activity, avoiding empty time. I thought constant movement meant progress. Over the years, I noticed something unexpected. Constant activity made my thinking shallow. I was reacting to situations instead of reflecting on them. One day, I intentionally left space in my schedule. I did not plan anything for that time. At first, it felt strange and unproductive. I even felt slightly uncomfortable, as if I were wasting time. Later, that quiet became necessary. It gave me space to think, reflect, and understand myself better. Shifts in values. When people talk about changes in life or priorities, they often use phrases like, I learned to slow down. I stopped filling every moment. These phrases show a shift in values, not just habits. They reflect maturity and self-awareness, not laziness or lack of ambition. Real-life stories like these help explain growth naturally. They rely on small realizations, quiet moments, and simple choices, rather than big events or dramatic language. This is why daily use stories are so powerful for learning English. They sound real because they come from real thinking, real emotion, and real experience. Story 1. Resolving disagreement. I once had a strong opinion about a decision that affected a group I was part of. I expressed my view clearly and confidently because I believed I was right. Another person disagreed just as strongly. The conversation became tense, but it never turned hostile. Instead of pushing my opinion harder, I paused and asked them to explain their reasoning. As they spoke, I listened carefully. I began to understand parts of their perspective I had ignored before. I did not completely change my mind, but I adjusted my position slightly. That small adjustment made the discussion more productive and respectful. When people describe healthy disagreement, they often use phrases like, "I saw their point." "I understood where they were coming from." These phrases show openness without weakness and confidence without aggression. Story 2. Waiting. There was a time when I was expecting an outcome I could not control. I checked my messages constantly and imagined different scenarios. Waiting became more exhausting than the result itself. I felt restless, distracted, and tense. Eventually, I accepted that uncertainty was part of the process. I reminded myself that worrying would not change the outcome. When the result finally arrived, it mattered less than I had imagined. When people talk about waiting, they often describe emotional cycles and use phrases like, "I kept checking." "I tried to distract myself." "I learned to let go." These phrases reflect real emotional experience and feel natural in conversation. Story 3. Changing habits. At one stage, I tried to change several habits at once. I wanted fast results and clear improvement. I believed that more effort would lead to quicker success. Instead, I felt overwhelmed and inconsistent. I started strong but quickly lost focus. After failing several times, I decided to simplify my approach. I focused on one small habit and protected it carefully. I did not aim for perfection, just consistency. Over time, that single habit began to influence other areas of my life naturally. In daily English, people often describe habit change with phrases like, "I started small." "I focused on one thing." These expressions show realism, patience, and self-awareness. Story 4. Feeling out of place. I remember walking into a room where everyone seemed more confident, experienced, and comfortable than I felt. I became aware of my posture, words, and even my silence. I questioned whether I belonged there. Over time, I realized that many people feel this way, even if they do not show it. Stories like these focus on internal experience rather than external success. They show thought, emotion, and reflection. When telling such stories, people often use phrases like, "I told myself." "I reminded myself." These phrases explain internal dialogue, showing what is happening inside rather than just what happened externally. Story 5. Regret. There was a time when I missed an opportunity because I waited too long to decide. At the moment, I told myself waiting was being careful and responsible. Later, I realized it was fear. Now, when I talk about it, I focus on understanding what stopped me, not blaming myself. Common phrases include, "I wish I had acted sooner." "I learned from that delay." These expressions allow reflection without negativity and show growth instead of regret. Story 6. Honesty. There was a moment when telling the truth felt risky. Avoiding the truth would have been easier in the short term. I knew honesty might create discomfort, but I chose it anyway. The discussion was difficult, but it brought clarity. The tension I feared did not last as long as expected. When people talk about honesty, they often use phrases like, "It was uncomfortable but necessary." "It cleared the air." These phrases show balance and emotional awareness. Story 7. Change in priorities. At one stage of my life, success meant external approval. I cared about how others saw me and what they thought. Later, my definition of success changed. It came to mean internal peace and balance. When people talk about shifts in priorities, they use phrases like, "I learned to slow down." "I stopped filling every moment." These phrases reflect values, maturity, and self-awareness, not laziness. Real-life stories like this show growth through small realizations, quiet moments, and simple choices. Shifts in priorities. Change does not happen suddenly. It happens gradually, through repeated moments of exhaustion and reflection. Slowly, I realized that constant pressure was not sustainable. When people describe this kind of shift, they often use phrases like, "My definition changed. I started valuing different things." These expressions sound thoughtful and mature. They show growth without drama, and they help learners explain change in a natural way. Real stories like these rely on small realizations, quiet moments, and simple choices rather than big events or dramatic language. Story 1. Learning through observation. I once noticed how someone handled pressure calmly, while others around them reacted emotionally. They spoke slowly, listened carefully, and did not rush to respond. Watching them made me reflect on my own reactions. I realized that calmness is often a choice, not a personality trait. When people share stories like this, they explain what they noticed and how it influenced them. Common phrases include, "I picked up on," "I noticed how." These expressions show learning through observation, not instruction, and they sound natural and thoughtful. Story 2. Disappointment turning into clarity. There was a time when I invested a lot of energy into something that did not work out. At first, I felt frustrated and disappointed. I thought my effort was wasted. Later, after some distance, I realized that the experience helped me clarify what I truly wanted. People often describe this shift with phrases like, "It showed me what mattered." "It helped me understand myself better." These expressions allow positive framing without ignoring difficulty. Story 3. Seeing routine differently. I once noticed that my days looked almost the same, but my attitude decided how those days felt. The tasks did not change, but my mindset did. By adjusting how I thought about my day, the same activities felt lighter and more manageable. People often describe this insight by saying, "Nothing really changed except my perspective." This phrase is common in reflective conversations because it highlights inner change rather than external events. Story 4. Asking for help. At one point, I believed that asking for help meant weakness. I tried to do everything alone, which became exhausting and ineffective. Eventually, I decided to ask for help clearly and directly. The response was supportive, not judgmental. When people talk about asking for help, they often say, "I should have asked sooner." This expression shows learning, humility, and growth. It demonstrates that strength sometimes comes from asking for help, not carrying everything alone. Story 5. Letting go. I once held tightly to an idea that had worked well in the past. Even when circumstances changed, I kept forcing the same approach, hoping it would work again. When I finally accepted the change and let go of that idea, progress became much easier. People often describe letting go with phrases like, "I realized it was time." "I stopped forcing it." These expressions sound calm and reflective. Stories like these focus on observation, realization, and small internal shifts. This is how real-life English sounds: simple, honest, and deeply human. Story 6. Appreciation. I once received feedback that was simple, honest, and sincere. At the time, I accepted it politely and moved on. Later, I realized how much those few words had boosted my confidence. People often share stories about appreciation with phrases like, "It stuck with me." "It stayed with me." These expressions show how small moments can have a lasting impact. Story 7. Finding balance. At one point, I focused too much on one area of my life and ignored others. At first, everything seemed fine. But over time, the imbalance caused stress, tiredness, and dissatisfaction. When people talk about balance, they They focus on awareness and reflection, not just correcting actions. They often use phrases that describe internal change and learning rather than external fixes. Key takeaways. From all these examples, real-life stories in English show internal thoughts, emotions, and reflections. Focus on gradual growth and learning. Use simple, natural phrases to describe feelings and realizations. Highlight small choices, quiet moments, and awareness. Reflect real thinking and human experience, not perfect storytelling. By practicing stories like these, your English will sound natural, like real conversations. Confident, because you show reflection and understanding. Thoughtful, by expressing emotions, observations, and growth. Restoring balance. Restoring balance in life does not require a dramatic change. Instead, it requires conscious adjustment. I had to notice what was missing in my daily routine and make small changes over time. When people explain balance in English, they often say things like, "I had to adjust. I found a better rhythm." These phrases sound practical and realistic. They show how small, consistent actions can create meaningful change. Saying no. There was a moment when I had to say no to an opportunity that seemed good on the surface. Many people expected me to accept it. My decision surprised both them and me. I explained my reasoning calmly and without apology. Afterward, I felt a sense of relief that confirmed I had made the right choice. Common expressions people use when telling these stories include, "It felt right." "I trusted my decision." These phrases show confidence without arrogance and clarity without defensiveness. Noticing distraction. At one point, I felt constantly distracted. I was physically present, but my attention was elsewhere. Conversations felt rushed, and my responses were automatic. One day, someone gently pointed out that I seemed distant. At first, I felt defensive. Later, I realized they were right. I had been dividing my attention without noticing. After that, I started to slow down and pay attention to how I showed up in conversations. I put my phone away, paused before responding, gave people my full attention. When people share stories like this, they focus on awareness rather than blame. Phrases often used include, "I didn't notice it at first." "I didn't want to admit it." These expressions show honesty and vulnerability, helping listeners understand that growth often begins with noticing, not with confidence or perfection. Adjusting expectations of yourself. There was a time when I believed I had to perform perfectly every day. If my focus or energy dropped, I felt like I had failed. At first, this mindset felt motivating, but over time, it became exhausting. I noticed that my creativity disappeared and my patience shortened. I was doing more but enjoying less. Eventually, I realized that consistency matters more than intensity. Showing up regularly was more important than pushing myself too hard. Common ways people explain this realization in English. I stopped being so hard on myself. I learned to allow off days. These phrases are gentle and realistic, reflecting maturity and self-respect rather than laziness. Learning later than expected. Sometimes, we learn something later than we wished. I once discovered a skill I wished I had learned much earlier. At first, regret was my strongest feeling. I kept thinking about lost time and missed opportunities. Slowly, curiosity replaced regret. I decided to focus on learning now instead of worrying about the past. Common expressions for this type of story. Better late than never. I focused on where I was, not where I should have been. These phrases are very common in reflective English, helping learners turn regret into motivation. Feeling misunderstood. I once explained my intentions clearly, but the message was received very differently. Instead of creating clarity, the conversation created distance. I felt frustrated. Instead of repeating myself more firmly, I tried to see the situation from the other person's perspective. Common ways to express this. I tried to see it from their perspective. This shows emotional intelligence, effort, and the idea that understanding is more important than being right. Patience with progress. I worked steadily toward a goal for a long time without seeing clear results. Nothing seemed to change. Doubt began to grow. I questioned whether my effort was worth it. Instead of giving up, I reminded myself that progress is not always visible. Some changes happen slowly beneath the surface. Over time, small improvements appeared and my confidence returned. When people describe this type of experience, they often focus on endurance rather than achievement. They talk about staying committed even when motivation fades. Key takeaways. Real-life English stories often focus on small, gradual growth rather than dramatic events. Show awareness and reflection. Include honest emotions, realizations, and changes in behavior. Use simple, natural phrases to describe feelings and experiences. Emphasize process and learning, not perfection or dramatic outcomes. Stories like these feel human, relatable, and thoughtful. They help you practice English that is natural and advanced, without relying on complex vocabulary. Quiet growth and reflection. Real-life stories often explain life the way people actually experience it, through reflection, adjustment, and quiet growth. For a long time, I questioned whether my effort was meaningful. I showed up, stayed consistent, and kept going, but nothing obvious seemed to change. Then, one day, a small sign of progress appeared. It wasn't dramatic or exciting, but it was real. This moment reminded me that progress often happens quietly, without attention or celebration. People often describe this kind of experience with phrases like, "It did not happen overnight." "Progress was slow but steady." These expressions sound calm, grounded, and honest. Moments of acceptance. There was a time when I stopped resisting a situation I could not change. I realized that fighting reality was draining my energy. When I accepted it fully, something shifted. I felt lighter and more focused. A simple phrase people use to explain this experience is, "I accepted it fully." This shows resolution and peace without needing extra explanation. Effort turning into habit. I once worked very hard to build a routine. At first, it required discipline and daily focus. Over time, the effort became natural, and I no longer had to force it. People often say, "It became part of my life." This shows integration and stability, not struggle. Growth without announcement. Sometimes you grow quietly, without feeling the need to explain it. I realized that my changes were visible through my behavior, choices, and reactions, not through words. A common way to describe this is, growth became quiet. This shows maturity and confidence without ego. Life moves forward. Daily stories often don't have clear endings because growth doesn't stop. Life doesn't pause to create perfect conclusions. Instead, stories move through. Reflection. Awareness. Choice. This is what makes English sound natural and advanced. It captures the way people honestly describe who they are becoming and what they are learning. Change that others notice first. Once someone told me I seemed more confident than before. At first, I didn't believe them. Inside, I still felt uncertain. Later, I realized, confidence often appears on the outside before it feels real on the inside. A phrase people often use. I didn't feel it yet, but others could see it. This shows how internal and external experiences can be very different. Boundaries and adjustment. I once set a boundary that felt right to me, but it surprised others. Their first reaction was silence, which made me uncomfortable. I wondered if I had done something wrong. Later, I realized, adjustment takes time. Common expressions for this. It felt awkward at first. People needed time to adjust. These phrases help normalize discomfort and remind us that change doesn't always bring immediate clarity. Accepting help without guilt. At one point, I received support during a difficult time. Instead of feeling grateful, I felt uncomfortable. I worried about being a burden and thought I should handle everything myself. Eventually, I realized support is part of human connection, not a transaction. People often say, I learned to accept help. I stopped feeling guilty for needing support. These phrases show emotional growth and self-compassion. Key lessons from real stories. Daily stories are quiet, honest, and thoughtful. They show how people learn through reflection, not perfection. Adjust their behavior gradually. Grow through awareness, choice, and simple actions. Real English is not about sounding impressive. It is about sounding real, clear, and meaningful. Small moments, quiet decisions, and honest reflections teach you to speak advanced English naturally. When you tell your own stories, focus on what you noticed, how you felt, and what you learned. Use complete thoughts and take your time. Let your ideas connect naturally instead of rushing. This is how your English becomes confident, natural, and deeply human. Moments of clarity through repetition. Sometimes, understanding comes slowly after hearing the same advice or lesson multiple times. I once heard the same advice from different people over time. Each time, I nodded politely but dismissed it, thinking I already knew enough. Then one day, it finally made sense. The advice hadn't changed, I had changed. My readiness to hear it had grown. People often describe this experience by saying, I was not ready to hear it before. This shows how timing affects understanding and is common in reflective storytelling. Stepping back instead of forward. There are times when our first instinct is to act immediately. I once faced a situation where I wanted to solve it quickly, but instead I paused. That pause stopped tension from growing and prevented unnecessary conflict. Common ways to describe this. I decided to wait. I chose not to react immediately. These phrases show patience and self-control without making the story dramatic. Invisible improvement. I practiced something regularly but didn't notice any progress at first. Frustration quietly grew, and I wondered if my effort was wasted. Then one day, I handled a situation naturally that would have been difficult before. That's when I realized improvement had been happening all along. People often say, I did not notice it until later. This simple phrase captures gradual growth in learning stories. Reevaluating success. I once reached a long-term goal, expecting a big feeling of satisfaction. Instead, the feeling was brief and almost surprising. That experience taught me, meaning comes from the process, not just the result. A common way to express this. The journey mattered more than the result. This reflects honest understanding and lived experience. Trust and balance. I once trusted someone without fully understanding the situation. The outcome wasn't what I hoped. At first, I could have closed off. Instead, I became more careful while still remaining open. People often say, I became more careful, not more closed. This phrase shows awareness and emotional maturity, focusing on lessons learned rather than failure. Adjusting communication. I used to think that being clear meant being direct all the time. Later, I realized tone and timing are just as important as words. A phrase that explains this is, it's not just what you say, but how you say it. This simple statement reflects subtle understanding in everyday conversations. Confidence through repetition. Confidence often grows slowly. I remember doing something uncomfortable many times. At first, it felt awkward. Each time, the discomfort decreased slightly. Eventually, the action became natural and easy. People describe this by saying, it got easier over time. This shows steady learning and growth. Stopping over-explaining. I used to feel the need to justify every decision. Over time, I realized explanations aren't always needed. People describe this shift by saying, I stopped over-explaining. This shows self-respect and confidence, setting boundaries without tension, letting things unfold. Sometimes, trying to control outcomes too tightly can make situations worse. I once held on too tightly. When I released control, things improved naturally. People often say, I stopped forcing it. This phrase shows patience, trust, and awareness. Awareness of patterns. I once noticed a pattern in my reactions across different situations. Recognizing it allowed me to respond differently instead of repeating mistakes. People often say, I started to notice a pattern. This simple phrase shows self-awareness and gradual change. Quiet resilience. There was a period when things repeatedly didn't go as planned. Small disappointments built up. Instead of giving up, I adjusted my approach and kept going. People often describe this by saying, I kept trying. I adjusted and continued. These phrases show patience, determination, and calm confidence. Key takeaway. Daily life stories like these are simple, reflective, and honest. They show learning through small moments, quiet adjustments, and gradual growth. Real English doesn't need drama or perfection. It is clear, thoughtful, and human, capturing the way people actually notice, feel, and learn in life. Growth through small, quiet lessons. Real-life stories often show growth, awareness, and learning, not dramatic endings or perfect solutions. By sharing small moments like these, your English becomes natural and relatable. It's about describing what you notice, how you feel, and what you learn, rather than trying to impress anyone. Real fluency comes from observing, reflecting, and expressing experiences clearly. Simple phrases carry real meaning. I stopped over-explaining. It got easier over time. I started to notice a pattern. These phrases make your English confident and aware. Stories like these focus on thought, feeling, and understanding, not just actions. Resilience. When people talk about resilience, they often describe adapting rather than giving up. I remember a time when things did not go as expected. I could have quit, but instead I chose to adjust my approach. Over time, I realized that small changes and persistence mattered more than dramatic results. Common expressions include, I adapted rather than quit. This shows strength, calmness, and control without exaggeration. Gratitude. Gratitude often comes slowly. I once took something stable and reliable in my life for granted. It was always there, so I didn't notice it. Later, when it changed, I realized how important it had been. People describe this by saying, I did not realize its importance until it was gone. This captures the quiet human realization that we often notice value only after it changes. Calm decision-making. I once faced pressure to make a quick choice. At first, I felt stressed and unsure. Then I asked for more time, and that short pause made a big difference in the outcome. People often say, taking time helped. This reflects patience, thoughtfulness, and steady judgment. Confidence and doubt. I used to believe that confidence meant being certain all the time. Later, I realized real confidence can exist even when we feel doubt. It means being okay with not knowing everything and moving forward anyway. People describe this with phrases like, I became comfortable with not knowing everything. These words show maturity and reflection. Revisiting patterns. Many real-life stories do not follow a straight line. People revisit the same idea, notice patterns, and refine their understanding over time. I once noticed that I reacted faster than I understood situations. One day, after responding in a way I later regretted, I paused and asked myself why I reacted so quickly. Over time, I learned to create a small gap between what happens and how I respond. Common expressions include, I learned to pause. I stopped reacting automatically. These capture awareness, control, and thoughtful decision-making. Observation, reflection, and patience. Patience, observation, and reflection appear again and again in daily stories. People describe small shifts in perspective or behavior that quietly but meaningfully change their lives. Instead of focusing on dramatic events, they focus on noticing patterns, adjusting reactions, and valuing experiences deliberately. Simple language can show growth, insight, and emotional awareness. Emotional patterns. Another real-life lesson is recognizing emotional patterns. I once noticed that certain situations triggered the same feelings repeatedly. At first, I blamed the situation itself. Later, I realized that my interpretation played a major role. People explain this insight by saying, "I noticed a pattern in how I felt." Key takeaway. Growth, confidence, awareness, and understanding often happen quietly over time through small choices and reflection. Advanced English does not need complicated vocabulary. It thrives on clarity, connection, and honesty. When you tell your own stories, focus on what you noticed, how you felt, and what you learned. Use clear sentences, take your time, and let each idea flow naturally. This is how English becomes confident, relatable, and real. Moments of quiet confidence. Some of the most important growth comes gradually, not suddenly. I once stopped needing validation from others to feel secure in my choices. This change happened slowly, through repeated experiences of trusting my own judgment. People often describe this shift by saying, "I became more comfortable with my decisions." This expression sounds calm, grounded, and self-assured, knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. I once entered a discussion intending to prove a point. As the conversation went on, I realized that understanding mattered more than winning. I chose to listen instead of responding. Later, I felt satisfied rather than frustrated. Common phrases for this experience include, "I did not need to prove myself." This reflects emotional maturity and self-control. Growth that feels slow. Sometimes progress is quiet and subtle. I once expected progress to be obvious and measurable. Instead, it appeared in small moments. Handling stress more calmly. Communicating more clearly. Recovering from disappointment faster. People often describe this type of learning as, "Change was subtle but real." This phrase captures gradual improvement and steady growth. Adjusting self-expectations. There was a time when I believed that rest had to be earned. I treated it as a reward rather than a necessity. Over time, this led to exhaustion. When I changed my approach and allowed rest as part of daily life, I noticed a positive shift in energy and focus. People often describe this by saying, "I learned to take care of myself." I stopped seeing rest as optional. I stopped seeing rest as weakness. These phrases show balance, self-awareness, and practical wisdom. Moments of clarity after confusion. Sometimes clarity comes only after internal priorities shift. I once struggled with an overwhelming decision. One day, the answer felt clear, not because the situation changed, but because my perspective had changed. People often describe this with, "It finally made sense." This simple phrase carries deep emotional weight. Effort that doesn't need to be visible. I once believed that working hard meant showing how busy I was. Later, I realized that effectiveness often looks quiet. Common ways people express this insight include, "I focused on results, not appearance." This shows mature understanding of work and value. Letting go of comparison. I used to constantly compare my progress to others. This created pressure and dissatisfaction. When I stopped comparing and focused on my own path, my motivation improved. People often say, "I stopped measuring myself against others." This phrase reflects a common, relatable struggle. Rediscovering curiosity. There was a period when I approached learning as a task rather than an opportunity. Over time, my interest faded. When I let curiosity guide me again, learning felt lighter and more enjoyable. People often describe this by saying, "I found my curiosity again." This expresses renewal and openness. Emotional resilience. I once faced repeated setbacks that tested my patience. Instead of becoming bitter, I learned to be selective about where I invested my energy. I realized some situations deserved attention while others did not. People often express this insight with, "I learned where to invest my effort." This shows thoughtfulness and self-respect. Knowing when to step back. Sometimes, stepping back is the right choice. I once stayed involved in a situation longer than I should have, out of a sense of responsibility. Later, I understood my presence was no longer helpful. Common phrases include, "I knew it was time to step away." This shows awareness, patience, and emotional maturity. Awareness and timing. Some lessons come from noticing the right moment. I once realized that something I wanted no longer matched who I was becoming. Admitting this was hard, but it allowed me to move forward. People often describe moments like this by saying, "I was honest with myself." This phrase marks a turning point in how we see our own choices. It shows awareness and understanding of timing. Simplifying life. Life can become simpler when we focus on what really matters. I used to believe that having more options meant more freedom. Later, I saw that too many choices caused confusion. When I reduced my options, making decisions became easier. Common expressions for this insight include, "I simplified things." "I reduced my options to make life clearer and more manageable." These phrases reflect clarity, focus, and practical wisdom. Learning by observation. We often learn as much from watching others as from direct instructions. I once observed someone handle failure calmly and openly. They did not hide or dramatize their mistake. Instead, they accepted it and moved on. I learned by simply paying attention. People often describe this experience with, "I learned by watching." This shows that lessons do not always come from instructions, they can come from seeing how others act. Rebuilding confidence after doubt. Confidence often grows gradually through small, repeated successes. I remember a time when I questioned my abilities after a challenge. Instead of forcing myself to push harder, I focused on small steps to rebuild trust in myself. Over time, these little successes strengthened my confidence. Common ways to describe this process include, "I focused on small steps." "I made steady progress." These phrases reflect patience, resilience, and realistic growth. Finding balance. Everyday life teaches lessons about how we spend our energy. I noticed that spreading myself too thin left me tired and distracted. I learned to focus on a few important things and let go of the rest. People often explain this shift with phrases like, "I started paying attention to what really matters." "I chose where to put my energy." These simple expressions show thoughtful decision-making, self-awareness, and balance.